Usually when a wrestler gets to a certain level in the industry, they're guaranteed to have a career. Sure, it might not always be in the big leagues of WWE, but at least a smaller role on a less watched stage is usually an option. Unfortunately though, that's not the case for everyone out there. No, some people get their moment in the sun and then disappear off the map entirely. And it's these people we're going to be looking at today, starting with one of the more recent examples of this phenomenon, the Velveteen Dream. Yes, the Velveteen Dream. Rarely has a performer who seemed to have the world at his feet fallen so hard so fast. Sure, there are reasons for this, with him getting into a lot of trouble behind the scenes. However, before all of this happened, back in the mid to late 2010s, he was one of the most over acts on the entire NXT roster. And when you consider the absolutely stacked roster they had back then, that's quite an achievement. And all this from someone who was never exactly an indie darling prior to his time in WWE either. No, the Velveteen Dream's entrance to the world of wrestling didn't come through years of toiling away in smaller promotions. Rather, it happened when he became a contestant on the rebooted version of Tough Enough in 2015. So considering this was his debut for many fans then, it's impressive that he got as over as fast as he did. But then with the entertaining character he had, one which was basically what if Prince was a wrestler, it was hard for fans not to fall in love with him, even if he was a heel. And this led to the Dream finding a lot of success on the black and gold brand towards the turn of the decade, with him even becoming North American champion at one point. Sadly though, not long after that title win, things would begin to fall apart for him when he got into a major controversy behind the scenes. And this would all lead to him eventually being released by WWE in 2021. Needless to say then, he's still been unable to make a comeback anywhere else. And because of this, he's since largely gone forgotten by many fans. Could a return ever happen for Velveteen Dream? Possibly, as you can never say never in wrestling. And there is still a chance we eventually see a return from another subject, someone else who was once briefly a fixture of the NXT roster, someone who went by the name of No Way Jose. Yes, No Way Jose, the man who danced his way down to the ring at the head of a conga line. Sure, he might never have been a performer people perceived as a top-level act, and he was certainly never going to be in contention for any major titles. But there's always a place for a more lighthearted comedic gimmick in wrestling, and this was the role that Levi's Venezuela filled in WWE back between 2015 and 2020. Hell, WWE had much success prior to this with characters like Santino Marella or R-Truth, so even if it was undercard in its nature, there should always have been a spot for Jose on the roster. And for a while at least, there was, because whether it be his time spent in NXT in the middle of the decade, or his later run on Raw towards the close of it, he could regularly be seen in backstage segments, or dancing his way down to the ring to try and do something like take the 24/7 title off of R-Truth. So what happened to change things for the Durham native then? Well, 2020 happened. That's right, being someone who was deemed expendable, No Way Jose would find himself one of the many victims of the mass wave of releases being carried out at this point. And ever since then, we haven't seen too much of him in the larger wrestling world. Sure, there would be a brief run in Impact between 2020 and 2021, but that would only be brief. And since then, Jose has disappeared from wrestling entirely, with him not even being seen on the indie circuit. Does this mean he's retired? Possibly. And because he never really got a chance to fully establish himself amongst the canon of WWE comedy greats like the aforementioned R-Truth and Santino Marella, it's meant that it's been very easy for fans to forget all about him as time has gone on. Still though, there's always the possibility that No Way Jose could make a return at some point, as like we said, there will always be a place for a lower card comedy act in wrestling, even if that person's role is to lead a conga line down to the ring during one segment a week, so we can't say for sure we'll never see him again. What we can say with some more assuredness, however, is that our next forgotten wrestler truly is gone. Who are we talking about here? Why, Eli Cottonwood, of course. Don't remember Eli Cottonwood? We're not surprised, because he was never exactly what you'd call a notable name. And that's surprising in many ways, because with him being 7'1" and 330 pounds, he should have been a perfect fit for what Vince McMahon was looking for back in the late 2000s and early 2010s. But for one reason or another, the boss never really took to Cottonwood the way he did other giants like the Great Khali or the Big Show, and this has left him to be resigned to the forgotten part of history. Yes, it's true there were a few moments where it looked like things might be moving in the right direction for the big man, primarily those moments when he was an early member of the Wyatt family back when they were an FCW act. But with him leaving the group before they ever made it to the main roster, it meant only the most hardcore of fans ever got a chance to see this when it was happening. And while he did make an appearance on the second season of NXT back when it was in its game show format, there being mentored by John Morrison, he was one of the first people eliminated and thus easily forgotten. Really, the case of Eli Cottonwood is a sad one then, because by all logic he should have been a star in the 2010s, but with that main roster call-up never seeming to be in the pipeline for him, he decided it wasn't worth hanging around in developmental any longer. And this was why, in June of 2012, he'd request and be granted his release from WWE, with him from there only doing sporadic indie dates before retiring altogether in 2016. Could a late career return happen for the River Falls native? No, we don't think so, as since leaving the wrestling industry behind almost a decade ago, Cottonwood appears to have built a whole new life for himself, doing things like running a yoga studio in Las Vegas and being a full-time father to his 2 children. That's right, this is by all accounts a rare case of an ex-wrestler getting a happy ending. But what about our next subject? That being Mojo Rawley. Now again, like with No Way Jose, we're not going to say that Mojo Rawley was ever going to be a WrestleMania main eventer. In fact, he was probably the Jannetty of his own tag team with Zack Ryder. But that didn't mean he wasn't a fun part of WWE TV whenever he appeared on it between 2012 and 2021. It didn't matter if it was his early days learning the craft down in NXT, his time as one half of the Hype Bros on both Raw and SmackDown, or his later run as a 24/7 title contender. It was never a chore to watch Mojo do his thing. Unfortunately for him though, even if he did have a lot to offer as an undercard act, there is always going to be a shelf life for this kind of gimmick. And for Rawley, that shelf life expired in 2021 because after spending his later days becoming a 7-time 24/7 champion and the man entrusted with a truly bizarre broken mirror character, he'd find himself being released from the promotion. What would the Virginia native do after this? Well, while you might have expected him to follow in the footsteps of his old friend and tag team partner Zack Ryder by going to places like TNA and GCW, in the process becoming a stalwart of the indies, this isn't the path Mojo Rawley chose. No, instead he'd disappear, rarely if ever being seen inside a ring again. Why did he choose to do this rather than continue working? That's hard to say. We can't imagine it was for lack of job opportunities though, as we're pretty sure he wouldn't have any problem getting work in another promotion. Maybe he just decided enough was enough when it came to the wear and tear on his body then, and that it was time for him to hang up his boots because of this. We can't say for sure. But let's move away from the world of WWE for a while, because they're not the only company who had performers work for them that later disappeared off the face of the earth. No, the exact same thing could be said about WCW and a former star of theirs, a star named Blitz Cre. Well, maybe we're being generous by using the term star here, as back during the late 90s when World Championship Wrestling was at its peak, Blitz Cre was never exactly challenging people like Sting, Goldberg, or Diamond Dallas Page for the top spot down in Atlanta. No, he was much more of a mid-card act, one whose role on the show was usually to get bigger, more famous stars over. That said, this shouldn't suggest Jeremiah Ross, the man behind the gimmick, didn't make his presence felt in his own small way, as he had his fair share of entertaining matches against the likes of Juventud Guerrera, Dean Malenko, and Rey Mysterio. Yes, during an era where WCW's cruiserweight division was its secret weapon, and the one thing it did better than WWF, Blitz Cre was a regular fixture there. No, he never won any titles, and he never really got a major push as either a babyface or a heel, but go back and look at some of the best bouts of that time period for Nitro, and you'll probably find him popping up here or there. So why has he since gone completely AWOL? Well, because in 1999, after a career which lasted just 5 years, he decided to call it a day and hang up his boots for good. Sure, it might seem like a strange decision to make considering he was a TV star, but there could have been extenuating circumstances such as wear and tear on the body, which made him feel like it really was best to move on to a new chapter of his life as the new millennium dawned. And it wasn't as if he'd never stepped foot inside of a wrestling ring again, as in 2004 he'd make a brief return at a professional wrestling war event in California to officially hand over his old gimmick to Jack Evans. As to what else the now former Blitz Cre has been doing with his life since the late 90s, well, it appears he became a nurse pretty soon after retiring, and that this is a job he continues to do right up until this day. That's right, it's another case of a wrestler getting out of the industry and going on to have a happy life afterwards. But what about our next subject? Someone who has also been something of a missing person since leaving the wrestling world behind in 2001. The one, the only, Jerry Flynn. No, that wasn't a typo. We're not talking about Jerry Lynn, star of ECW. Rather, we're talking about someone who, while he does share a very similar name, bears no real connection to the Minnesotan, as he is a native of Tampa, Florida, one who is most famous for his run in WCW during the mid to late 90s. Sure, there were other companies Flynn worked for throughout his career, something his brief spells in both WWF and New Japan will attest to, but few, if any, think about these excursions if they think about him today. No, his real claim to fame came from the times he'd be utilized as something of a jobber to the stars on Nitro, with this being a role he often played to perfection. Take, for example, the time he was fed to a rising young star named Bill Goldberg during early 1998. We're not saying he's the reason Goldberg got over or anything, but him bumping around for the Tulsa native and making him look like an absolute killer certainly helped to add to his overall aura. And when he wasn't doing jobs for main eventers, Jerry Flynn was often found in the undercard getting involved in storylines with the likes of Ernest the Cat Miller, Tank Abbott, or the First Family. So it wasn't like he never had anything to do, even as World Championship Wrestling was beginning to fall apart around him. Unfortunately though, when that promotion finally did fall apart for good at the turn of the millennium, there would be no interest in bringing Flynn over to WWF as part of the invasion. And this left him with few options then, as come 2001, Vince McMahon's company was really the only game in town for any wrestler who wanted to earn a proper living in North America. So seeing the writing on the wall, it appears the Floridian decided it was best to call it a day and find a new life, rather than work on the indie circuit. Could things have been different if he'd waited a couple of years for places like Ring of Honor and TNA to rise to prominence? Maybe. But then it's not like Flynn was likely to be a top guy though, unfortunately. Not when his competition would have been people like Bryan Danielson, AJ Styles, and Samoa Joe. But let's move away from WCW and back over to WWE as we now look at the case of Mason Ryan. Yes, Mason Ryan is another person many fans might not remember too much about because despite being a muscle-bound Welsh version of Batista who rose to prominence in WWE during the early 2010s, he never really managed to make that much of a mark. Sure, you could argue that Ryan was never destined to be as big of a star as the Animal, but he could have certainly been more than he was, which was a throwaway member of the new Nexus. That's right, the version of the Nexus that was somehow even less consequential than the original incarnation was the peak of where Mason Ryan went during his time on the main roster between 2011 and 2012. Needless to say then, he wouldn't find much success there, and at no point would he feel like someone who was in any real consideration for title contention, whether that be singles or tag team gold. And this all ultimately led to him being demoted during the latter year, as it was in the autumn of 2012 that Ryan returned to NXT and there set up shop full-time, with this being where he would remain right up until the point he was released in 2014. But at least there was that post-WWE career, right? The chance for the big man to prove that the company had used him wrong and that he really did have it in him to be a star all along? Well, unfortunately, this wasn't exactly how things went, because unlike performers such as Drew McIntyre or Cody Rhodes, who have shown just how much they can thrive outside of WWE, Mason Ryan's latter career would only see him pop up in a few indies for about a year and a half, all before he retired from the ring completely. But that doesn't mean he's been doing nothing exciting though. In fact, he's been quite busy in a whole new career, as since 2016 he's been working as an archer for Cirque du Soleil, one of the most famous and highly regarded traveling circuses in the world today. Yes, while he may not be wrestling anymore, Mason Ryan is doing great. But what about our next subject? That being legendary independent wrestler Reckless Youth. Yes, if you were a fan of indie wrestling during the late 90s and well into the 2000s, then there's a good chance you were a fan of Reckless Youth. And the reason for that was because he was one of the biggest names of this circuit back then, someone so notable that his name is still remembered today. This despite the fact that he never made it to WWF, WCW, or even ECW on any meaningful basis. No, fully leaning into the punk rock spirit of backyard wrestling, the man who goes by the real name of Thomas Carter never signed with any of these promotions. And this suited him just fine because it gave him more than enough time and space to ply his craft in places like Combat Zone Wrestling and Chikara. Of course, given the fact that this was his ceiling in terms of visibility, it meant that Reckless Youth never managed to become a mainstream star like some of his contemporaries did. And given the amount of wear and tear that a decade plus of wrestling had on his body, in 2010, he'd hang up his boots once and for all at a United Wrestling Coalition show in December of that year. And with him showing no sign of wanting to make a comeback at any point since then, it looks like we've truly seen the last of the Indies legend right now. Sure, there's always the chance he'll make a return like so many others in wrestling have over the years, but while this might seem sad considering there was never that big mainstream run for Reckless Youth, it's not a guarantee that a role at a larger promotion would have made him a guaranteed star. After all, it's not like our next subject had a great time in the big leagues before they dropped off the map in 2011. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Jacob Novak? That's right, we're really getting into the weeds of obscure names from early 2010s WWE here, as Jacob Novak is easily forgotten. And the reason for that is because during his run there, he never really did anything of note outside of appearing on the 4th and 5th seasons of NXT back when it was still in its game show format. Why did Novak appear twice on NXT? Well, because after failing to get very far during season 4, he'd get a second chance a year later, because the gimmick of that series would be that it was a chance at redemption for those contestants who had flopped the first time around. Unfortunately for the rookie, however, even if he did have JTG as a mentor here during his second go-round, he'd still fail to make much of an impact. And this became very apparent when, during the first night there, he'd be taking a loss to Darren Young. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to learn that for the second time in a row, Jacob would find himself being the first contestant eliminated from NXT, with this giving him quite an unfortunate spot in the history books of WWE. What would he do after that? Well, apparently deciding wrestling was no longer for him, Jacob Novak would disappear from the industry entirely. But what about our next subject? Someone who went by the name of Bull Dempsey. That's right, Bull Dempsey, someone who, for a brief period at least, felt like he might have a future as a player in the WWE. Yes, it was after spending almost a decade on the indie circuit honing his craft that in 2013 he signed on the dotted line with WWE and there reported straight to NXT. Would this lead to the Brooklyn native quickly rising up the ranks, winning a title or two, and then making a big splash on the main roster, all as some had hoped he might when he put pen to paper? No, sadly. Instead, Dempsey would flame out for one reason or another, with him doing little of note on the developmental brand outside of teaming with Mojo Rawley for a while, and then becoming something of a comedy character with his Bull Fitness regime. Obviously then, because he never found his groove in NXT, the main roster would always remain out of reach for the big man. And so, when he was finally cut from his contract in 2016, he'd be gone from WWE before he ever got a chance to appear on either Raw or SmackDown. And this would have the knock-on effect of meaning that now back on the indie circuit, his value wasn't as high as it could have been, as his opportunities there weren't as wide and varied. So with little to do other than pop up in Ring of Honor for a brief period in 2016, that and get an odd shot here and there for the likes of Combat Zone Wrestling, it became clear to Bull Dempsey after a while that wrestling just wasn't for him on a full-time basis. And that was why in 2018 he'd largely decided to walk away from the industry, with him only making the occasional appearance at smaller promotions in the years since then. Yes, even as recently as 2024, the big man has still been working, with it looking like he's happy here and has no plans to make a comeback to a larger promotion. But the same thing could really be said about most of the wrestlers we've looked at today, because despite once being people who had some level of notoriety in the wrestling business, they've since fell off the map, with most of them unlikely to return to the big leagues anytime soon.